He had just won the Champions League. The confetti was still falling. 60,000 people were on their feet. His teammates were sprinting toward each other, crashing together in a tangle of disbelief and joy that looked like something between a collision and an embrace. And Cristiano Ronaldo, the man who had scored the goal, the man whose name was being chanted by tens of thousands of voices until the sound became something physical, something you could feel in your chest, was standing completely still in the middle of all of it. Not frozen. Still. Deliberately, privately still. Because in that moment, surrounded by the loudest celebration of his professional life, he was somewhere else entirely. He was in a small house in Madeira. He was sitting at a kitchen table that had seen too many difficult conversations and not enough easy ones. He was looking at the faces of the people who had given everything so that he could be standing on this pitch, in this stadium, holding this trophy. And he made himself feel that. He made himself stay with it. Because the people in that kitchen, the woman who had scrubbed floors, the father who had struggled and lost and loved imperfectly, they were the reason. All of it. Every goal. Every record. Every impossible thing he had ever done. It was never about the football. It was always, only, entirely about them. Before there was a brand, before there was a statue, before there was a museum or a private jet or a name that every child on every continent could recognize, before any of that, there was a family. A specific, complicated, deeply human family living in a small house on a volcanic island in the Atlantic Ocean, doing what families in tight circumstances have always done, holding on to each other with everything they had and hoping it was enough. The Aveiro family of Santo Antonio, Madeira, was not remarkable by any external measure. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were not the kind of family whose children were expected to change the shape of history. José Diniz, the father, worked modest jobs that paid modest wages. Maria Dolores, the mother, cleaned other people's homes and worked restaurant shifts and took whatever work was available because there were 4 children to feed and the bills did not pause to consider whether the money was there. Hugo, Elma, Liliana Cadia, the older siblings who grew up knowing that extra was a luxury and enough was the realistic ambition. And then the youngest. The boy born on February 5, 1985, who came into the world at a time when the family had less than it needed and somehow, from the very first years, seemed to burn with a heat that the circumstances around him couldn't quite contain. What is important to understand about Cristiano's childhood, and what gets consistently flattened in a simplified version of his story that the world prefers, is that it was not simply hard. Hardship alone does not produce what he became. The world is full of people who grew up in difficult circumstances and were shaped by them in ways that had nothing to do with greatness. What made the difference, in the Aveiro household, was something subtler and more essential than poverty or struggle. It was love. Not the easy, uncomplicated love of fairy tales. The real kind, the kind that shows up when it's exhausted, that keeps giving when there's almost nothing left to give, that makes decisions that hurt in the short term because they are right in the long term. The love that lets go at an airport gate because it loves too much to hold on. Dolores has spoken, in interviews across many years, about what it meant to raise Cristiano. Not the famous version of him, the version that exists on magazine covers and stadium scoreboards. The actual boy. The boy who was so hungry for football that she sometimes had to physically bring him inside after dark. The boy who cried with a fullness and an abandon that she found both heartbreaking and oddly reassuring, because a child who can cry that freely, she always felt, was a child who had not yet learned to be ashamed of what he felt. The boy who, even at 5 and 6 years old, had something in his eyes when he talked about playing professionally that made her quietly, carefully believe him. Not because it seemed likely. Because it seemed true. And José, the father who history has treated somewhat harshly, and not without reason, but whose complexity deserves more space than it usually gets. He was not a simple man. He was not simply a failure or simply a victim of his own weaknesses. He was a man who loved his children with a genuineness that coexisted, painfully, with an addiction that he could not conquer. He was a man who worked in the world of football at its most humble level, as a kit man, maintaining equipment, staying invisible, while his youngest son was becoming something the football world had never quite seen before. He was a man who, by all accounts, felt the particular and devastating pride of watching your child exceed everything you ever were or could have been. And who carried, alongside that pride, the private grief of knowing that his own struggles had cost his family in ways he could not entirely repair. Cristiano has never spoken about his father with anything other than love. Complicated love, careful love, love that acknowledges difficulty without being destroyed by it, but love. And that love, sustained across years and across the distance of death, is one of the clearest windows into who Cristiano Ronaldo actually is when the performance is set aside. But what happened between this family and the football world is the part that changes how you see everything else. When Cristiano left Madeira at 12 years old to join the Sporting CP Academy in Lisbon, the family made a calculation that only families in certain kinds of circumstances ever have to make. The calculation that goes, we cannot give him what he needs here, and what he needs might actually exist somewhere else, and the price of getting it there is letting him go. It sounds simple when you describe it that way. It is one of the hardest things a family can do. Hugo, the older brother, has spoken about that period in terms that give you a sense of what it looked like from inside the family. He describes the house feeling different after Cristiano left. Quieter. Not just because a person was absent, but because the particular energy that Cristiano carried, that constant, restless, burning engine of a personality, was suddenly no longer filling the rooms. And you don't realize, until something like that is gone, how much space it had been taking up. How much it had been, in its own way, holding everything together. Dolores called Lisbon as often as she could. This was not a cheap thing in those days, international calls cost real money, and real money was something the Aveiro family measured carefully. But she called anyway. Because her son was a 12-year-old boy 600 miles away in a dormitory full of strangers, and the sound of her voice was the only piece of home available to him. He would tell her about training, about the other boys, about the coaches. He would try to sound okay. And she would listen, with the particular attentiveness of a mother who has known her child's voice since before he could form words, and she would hear the things he wasn't saying as clearly as the things he was. Elma, the eldest sister, has described the way the family talked about Cristiano during those years. With a mixture of pride and worry and love that was so thoroughly entangled that she says she sometimes struggled to know which feeling was which. They watched his progress from Madeira with a combination of fierce hope and protective anxiety, the anxiety of people who understand, from personal experience, exactly how narrow the gap is between the version of a story where everything works out and the version where it doesn't. And Liliana, the sister whose own life took a trajectory very different from the global stage, who stayed closer to Madeira and to the more ordinary rhythms of everyday existence, has said that watching her brother become what he became was one of the most overwhelming experiences of her life. Not just because of the scale of his success, but because she remembered the boy. Because she had been there for the before. Because she could hold, simultaneously, the image of the most famous footballer in the world and the image of a small child kicking a ball against a wall in the dark until someone made him come inside. And somehow the two images were the same person. That is what family does, when it's working the way it's supposed to. It holds the full picture. It keeps the complete story alive even when the world is only interested in the highlight reel. But here is the moment that nobody outside the family has ever fully understood. José Diniz Aveiro died in September 2005. He was 52 years old. His liver had failed, finally and completely, after years of damage from alcoholism that had shaped the family's life in ways that were never fully visible from the outside. He died when Cristiano was 20 years old and already at Manchester United, already recognizable, already becoming the thing that nobody from that small house in Santo Antonio could have entirely imagined. He died too early. He died without seeing most of what his son would go on to become. And that fact, simple and irreversible, is one that Cristiano has carried with him every day since. There is a particular cruelty to losing a parent in your early 20s, when you are just beginning to understand them as a person rather than simply as a parent. When the relationship is in the process of becoming something more equal, more reciprocal, more like two adults who share a history. When there are still things unsaid that you believed you had time to say. José's death took all of that time away. Left all of those conversations unfinished. Left Cristiano with a grief that had no clean resolution, not just the grief of losing a father, but the grief of losing the possibility of the relationship they might eventually have had. He has spoken about his father across many years and in many different contexts, and what is striking is the consistency of the tenderness. No bitterness. No carefully managed public relations version of forgiveness that masks private resentment. Just love. The complicated, clear-eyed love of a son who understood his father's failures and chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to hold on to what was real and good about him rather than to let the difficulties define the whole picture. He dedicated goals to his father. He spoke his name in interviews when he didn't have to. He brought his memory into rooms where most people would have left it outside. Because for Cristiano Ronaldo, his father is not an embarrassment or a complication to be managed. He is part of the story. A necessary part. The part that reminds you that people who love you are not required to be perfect, and that love received imperfectly is still love. After José died, Cristiano did something that very few people at his level of fame, with his particular image to maintain, would have done. He spoke about missing him in simple, direct language that had no performance in it. He said he wished his father could see him play. He said he thought about him on the big nights. He said he would have liked to have had more time. Those sentences cost him something. You can tell, when you watch the interviews where he says them, that they cost him something. And the fact that he said them anyway, that he chose honesty over image management, that he let the world see the loss because the loss was real and the man it belonged to deserved to be remembered, is one of the most quietly courageous things about him. In 2007, when Cristiano was 22 and in the middle of his most explosive period at Manchester United, his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. She kept it quiet for as long as she could. This is so entirely consistent with who she is that it would be surprising if she had done anything else. Dolores Aveiro is not a woman who calls attention to her own suffering. She is a woman who deals with things and keeps moving. She had been doing it her entire life. But Cristiano found out. And when he did, something shifted in him that all the professional success and public bravado in the world couldn't touch. Because here was the one thing his money and his talent and his extraordinary drive could not fix. He could train harder than any human being alive and it would not help his mother. He could score in every match for the rest of the season and it would not affect the cells dividing in her body. He could do the one thing he had always been able to do when faced with an obstacle, pour everything he had into overcoming it, and it would make no difference. That particular helplessness is one that almost everyone eventually faces, and almost everyone finds it devastating. But for someone like Cristiano, someone whose entire identity was organized around the belief that effort and will and refusal could conquer any obstacle, it was something more than devastating. It was a confrontation with the limits of everything he believed about how the world worked. He visited her whenever the schedule allowed. He called constantly. He made sure she had access to the best available care, using resources he hadn't yet had as a child when the family had needed them in different ways. And through it all he played football, because the world doesn't stop for private grief and the obligations don't pause, but the people who watched him carefully during that period noted something in his performances that went beyond the usual intensity. A kind of desperate focus. Like a man who has decided that if he cannot control the thing that matters most, he will at least control everything he can. Dolores recovered. The treatment was successful, the cancer went into remission, and she came back, not diminished by what she had been through but somehow, characteristically, more herself than ever. Cristiano dedicated goals to her recovery. He spoke about her in interviews with the same undefended love he had always shown her, but with an added quality now, a quality of someone who has come close to losing something and has been allowed to keep it, and who understands, more fully than before, exactly what that means. She would face the illness again years later, a second diagnosis that she fought with the same refusal to be defeated. And Cristiano was there, each time, in the ways available to him. Not always physically, the geography of his career made constant presence impossible. but present in the way that counts. The calls. The visits when he could make them. The public acknowledgments that said, to anyone who was listening, "This woman is the most important person in my life, and I will not pretend otherwise." Hugo Aveiro is not a famous person. He does not have a global brand or a Wikipedia page that most people have read or a face that strangers recognize in airports. He is Cristiano's older brother, and for most of his life he has existed in the enormous shadow that his younger brother's fame casts over everyone who stands near it. He has managed aspects of Cristiano's career. He has been present at significant moments. He has been photographed at his brother's side at events around the world. But the most important thing Hugo Aveiro did for his brother, the thing that says more about what family actually means than any public moment, happened not in a stadium or at a press conference but in the quiet, unglamorous years when Cristiano was still becoming what he would eventually be, and the shape of that becoming was not yet clear. Hugo made choices. He stayed. He prioritized the family's collective well-being over his own individual ambitions in ways that are common in families stretched thin by circumstance but that rarely get acknowledged or celebrated because they happen in private and because the people who make them tend not to talk about it. He was there for Dolores when Cristiano couldn't be. He held pieces of the family together that would otherwise have come apart. He was, in the unglamorous and essential way of older siblings in struggling families, one of the reasons things held. Cristiano has spoken about his relationship with Hugo with a warmth and a specificity that suggests a bond of genuine depth rather than obligatory fraternal loyalty. He says Hugo is one of the few people in his life he trusts completely. One of the few people who knew him before, who carries the full picture, who can look at everything Cristiano has become and see it in proportion, neither dazzled by it nor diminished by it. Just a brother. The most straightforward and the rarest thing. In the world that Cristiano inhabits, a world where almost everyone wants something, where genuine disinterest is almost impossible to find, where the line between affection and calculation is rarely clear, that kind of relationship is not just valuable. It is foundational. It is one of the things that keeps him tethered to something real. To the version of himself that existed before the fame arrived and began constructing its own version of who he was. And now we come to the part of the story that moved the entire world. Cristiano Ronaldo's first child, Cristiano Jr., was born in 2010. The mother's identity has never been publicly confirmed, and Cristiano has been consistent and absolute in his commitment to protecting their privacy, a position he has maintained through years of media pressure with a firmness that says everything about what kind of father he intended to be before the child could have any say in who knew his story. From the beginning, the relationship between Cristiano and his son was one of the most visible and consistently genuine things about his public life. Photographs of them together, at training, on the beach, in the simple domestic moments that are rare currency in the life of someone as famous as Cristiano, showed something that no amount of public relations management could have manufactured. A father who was genuinely, completely present with his child. Who got on the floor with him. Who laughed with him the unguarded laugh that is different from the smile you give to cameras. Who was, in those moments, not the brand or the athlete or the legend, just a father. In 2017, Cristiano became a father again, twins, Eva and Matteo, born via surrogacy, arriving into a family that was already in the process of becoming something larger and more complex than the one Cristiano had grown up in. And then Alana Martina, born later that same year to Georgina Rodriguez, the woman who had come into Cristiano's life and who had become, over time, not just a partner but a genuine and essential presence in the architecture of this expanding family. And then, in 2022, something happened that broke the hearts of people who had never met Cristiano Ronaldo and never would. Georgina was pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl. The girl survived. The boy did not. He was born and he died on the same day. And Cristiano, who had spent his entire career constructing an image of invincibility, who had made his name synonymous with the refusal to be beaten, posted a statement that had no armor in it at all. That was simply, nakedly, the words of a man in grief. He said there were no words to describe the pain they were feeling. He said he would cherish his daughter. He said he thanked people for their kindness. And then he asked for privacy in a moment of loss that was too large and too real for any public language to adequately contain. The response from the football world, from rivals and supporters and people across every divide of club loyalty and national allegiance, was a kind of collective tenderness that suggested how rarely we are allowed to see this. He does this not because it photographs well but because he grew up understanding, at a cellular level, what it means when that structure is absent. What it costs children when the ordinary things are not in place. And he will not let his children pay that cost if there is anything he can do to prevent it. He calls his mother. Still. Constantly. The way he did from that dormitory in Lisbon at 12 years old. The technology is better now and the distance is navigated differently, but the impulse is identical, to hear her voice, to know she is there, to maintain the connection that was the only piece of home he had when everything else was uncertain. She is still the first person he tells things to. Still the relationship that exists at the center of everything, around which all the other relationships of his life are arranged. This is the sacrifice that doesn't look like sacrifice from the outside. Because it looks like love. Because it is love. But maintaining it, keeping those connections alive and real and genuine across the distances and the pressures and the extraordinary demands of the life he lives, requires a deliberate, daily commitment that most people never see and that nobody gives him credit for. And here is the moment that brought every thread of this story together in one place. The night Cristiano won the European Championship with Portugal in 2016, in Paris, in the final against France, is one of the most written about nights of his career. People have analyzed the tactical dimensions of it, the emotional dimensions, the significance for Portuguese football, the meaning of it for him personally after so many years of trying to deliver a major international trophy for his country. But there is a moment from that night that gets less attention than the famous images of him hobbling on the sideline with a knee injury, coaching and directing and refusing to be absent even when he could not play. A quieter moment. A moment that happened not in the stadium but in the dressing room afterward, when the trophy had been lifted and the confetti had fallen and the noise had begun to settle into the specific satisfied silence of a celebration that has peaked and is now gently descending. Cristiano sat with his family. His mother. His siblings. His son, who was 5 years old and would not fully understand what he was watching until years later when someone explained it to him. And he held them. He held them the way people hold each other when something they have worked toward for a very long time has finally, actually, arrived. Not triumphantly. Quietly. With the fullness of someone who is genuinely present in a moment rather than performing presence for an audience. Dolores has described that moment in interviews with a simplicity that is more moving than anything elaborate could be. She said he held her hand. She said he didn't say very much. She said you could feel, in the way he was, that he was thinking about his father. About the person who wasn't there. About the person who would have been standing in that dressing room if 52 years had been enough. And she said that she thought about Jose too. That she let herself think about him fully, in that moment, without protecting herself from it. Because that night felt like the right time to feel all of it. The trophy was for Portugal. It was for the supporters who had waited decades for it. It was for the teammates who had run themselves into the ground to win it. But in that dressing room, in the quiet after the noise, it was also for a man who died too young and never got to see it. And for a woman who scrubbed floors and answered phones at midnight and stood at airport gates and let go. And for the older siblings who stayed and held things together when something needed to hold. And for a 5-year-old boy who would grow up to understand, eventually, what his father had done and what it had cost and what it had meant. Georgina Rodriguez came into Cristiano's life in 2016, and the story of how they met, in a Gucci store in Madrid, where she was working, a meeting so improbably cinematic that it would strain credulity if it appeared in a film, has been told many times. What has been told less often, and what matters more, is the story of what she became to the family he already had. Because Cristiano did not arrive as a single man with a clean slate. He arrived as a man with a son, with a mother, with siblings, with a family history of genuine weight and complexity. And Georgina, who had her own history, her own complexity, her own story of a childhood that was not always easy and a path to where she ended up that required more courage and more reinvention than most people know, stepped into all of that. Not as an outsider trying to find her place at the edges of an existing structure. As someone who chose to be genuinely part of it. Who built real relationships with Dolores and with the siblings. Who mothered Cristiano Jr. and the twins with a commitment that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with love. Who, when the boy they were expecting together did not survive, held the family through a grief that she was experiencing just as completely as everyone else. Cristiano has spoken about Georgina with a directness and a lack of protective irony that is notable in a man who is usually careful about what he reveals. He has said she is the woman he loves. He has said she is an extraordinary mother. He has said she makes the family whole in ways he did not know the family needed until she was there. And Dolores, who is not a woman who gives approval lightly, who is not a woman who says things she doesn't mean, has embraced her. Not performatively. Genuinely. This is what the family has chosen to be. Not the simplified version that the world projects onto it, the global superstar and his glamorous partner and their perfect children. The real version. Messy and full of history and carrying both losses and extraordinary joys, held together by the same force that held the original family together in that small house in Madeira. The same force that got Dolores up before sunrise and made her call Lisbon and let go at the airport gate. Love. Just love. In all its complicated, imperfect, absolutely essential reality, when people look at Cristiano Ronaldo, they see the goals. They see the trophies. They see the body, the brand, the statues, the records that keep falling to someone who was supposed to have peaked a decade ago. They see all the external, measurable, photographable evidence of an extraordinary life. But if you know the full story, if you know the kitchen table and the airport gate and the dormitory in Lisbon and the phone calls and the illness and the loss, you see something else. You see a man who carries his family with him everywhere he goes. Not as a burden. As a foundation. As the thing that makes all the other things possible and meaningful. Every goal he has ever scored has been dedicated, in some private and essential way, to people who were not on the pitch. To a woman who cleaned other people's floors so he could chase his dream. To a man who loved him imperfectly and died too soon. To siblings who stayed and held things together. To children who deserve a father who is genuinely, fully present. To a woman who chose to love all of it, the complexity and the history and the difficulty, along with the extraordinary. He has said, in interviews, that the trophies mean more when the people he loves are there to share them. He has said that coming home, really home, to the people, is the thing he looks forward to most after any match or any tournament or any achievement. He has said that the version of success that exists in stadiums, while he loves it and has dedicated his life to it, is not the version that feels most real. The most real version is smaller and quieter and happens in ordinary rooms with the ordinary people who have always been the reason. This is the story that the numbers cannot tell. The story of a family that gave everything so one of its members could go and become something impossible. The story of a man who received that gift and spent his entire life trying to give it back. Not in money, although the money has been given. Not in fame, although the fame has lit up the family's name in ways that nobody could have imagined. In presence. In loyalty. In the refusal, absolute and permanent, to forget where he came from and what it cost the people he loved most to get him to where he is. That is the real Cristiano Ronaldo story. Not the goals. Not the records. Not the statues or the brand or the global empire built from nothing. The boy who left Madeira with a small bag and a burning heart and the knowledge, certain and sustaining and more valuable than any trophy, that there were people at home who loved him completely and were counting on him not to waste it. He never forgot. He never stopped. He never let them down. And that, in the end, is everything.